Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. This morning, the markets have been rattled. It looks like a sell-off of US technology stocks may exceed $1 trillion. Some things are down 5%, 6%, 7%. We've got Bitcoin plummeting down beneath $100 again. Frankly, maybe crash is too strong a word for it, but serious jitters seem to be visible in the US stock market. What we want to ask today is, how serious is that? How should we explain it? Something called DeepSeek, which has come out of China, has obviously kicked off this particular set of nerves. And more broadly, how reliant is the Trump project on a booming stock market, and what would happen if that crash really began to develop? We have two experts and UnHerd contributors with us. Phil Pilkington, you may remember if you're a regular UnHerd viewer, is a macroeconomist. He is a writer and he's host of the Multipolarity podcast. And John Rapley, also an economist and writer and academic, is himself author of Why Empires Fall. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for having me.
Phil, let's start with what's happened this morning. DeepSeek, what is it and why is it freaking everybody out?
So DeepSeek is a AI model that's come out. It's actually a specific, DeepSeek's been around for a while. It's a specific model that they released last week called R1. And it's really, as you say, freaked people out, I guess. It is coming out of China. It's coming out of a very small firm called DeepSeek. It was made for only $6 million, apparently, which, just to give some sense, OpenAI, its competitor, was made for $600 million. So it was 1% the cost, just on investment terms. And it seems to compete with these very sophisticated AI models. The comparison is OpenAI 01 or O1 model. And the issue here, well, there's a few issues, but one issue is it's just so much cheaper. It's about 96% cheaper to use this thing. Obviously, that's completely freaking people out because 96% cut cost is not 10% cut cost. That is industry destroying, actually, because every other company will not be able to compete with this at all. The other issue, two other issues. One is that it's open source. The Chinese company has released it open source, which means that anyone can fiddle around with the algorithms and so on, which means you can build it into other products. A lot of American AI technology is not open source because in the West, and especially in America, we're very jealous of intellectual property, IP. And what we try to do is basically, for as long as possible, keep those type of technologies behind a wall, a paywall, in effect, until they leak out. But the Chinese have made this open source.
Right, because big businesses pay AI license fees to use their algorithm at scale, don't they?
Exactly. And so if you want to build some AI model into your business structure, you pay the toll, right? But if it's open source, not clear you have to do that. The final issue is that the DeepSeek AI model utilizes only about 10% of the GPU chip usage. Those are the graphics processing cards that are made by NVIDIA and AMD and companies like that obviously have had a huge boom recently. They only use 10% of that. An awful lot of the valuation of these companies is tied to very, very high expected future chip sales. I'm not saying that they've just been cut by a factor of 10, but they've been cut by a very, very large factor now. So that's going to weigh on NVIDIA, AMD, and so on. And we see these stocks already. We're pre-market right now at the time of recording, but they're already down double digits.
So this might sound a little bit like we've suddenly become a finance podcast, but actually this is pretty central to politics and to the broader economy, isn't it? Give us a sense, Phil, of how much of the recent boom has been connected to companies like NVIDIA. How much is AI responsible for investors feeling kind of rich at the moment?
NVIDIA and a few other of these AI-linked firms, mainly making these GPU units, which used to just be used for graphics cards until they found AI utilization, were driving a significant portion of the market. Just to give some sense of that, NVIDIA, just prior to DeepSeek coming on the scene and tanking its stock price, was about 14% of the NASDAQ index, so nearly 1/6 of the entire index was this one firm basically shipping one product, which were these chips that were going to be apparently used en masse for AI. These chips were being bought up by companies like Google, Meta, all these, and building out these enormous hardware networks that they were then going to use to train these AI language programs. But now with this new DeepSeek on the scene, you're probably not going to need that many chips. You're also going to take a big bite out of the AI sector itself, as I alluded to. And so there's a very good chance, look, you can never really call when a bubble bursts, but this is as good a trigger as any other to burst the stock market bubble. And if that happens, it'll have economic consequences and, as you say, political consequences.
Just want to introduce a note of skepticism about this claim from the Chinese owners that they produced this amazingly successful LLM, large language model, for only $6 million. I see here, top of the China Daily, the news site that is owned and sponsored by the Chinese government, R1 exemplifies open spirit of the internet. They're somehow claiming to be the open internet people, which you got to have a bit of a chuckle about, given that they're not famous for how open their internet is. Can we trust these claims, do you think, or should we really be quite skeptical of them?
I think it's relatively credible. I think there's a little bit of background that people need to know about this. If you're following financial news carefully, in the past 2 weeks, there was an announcement that NVIDIA chips would actually be restricted to China. America are trying to engage in these technology sanctions against China. They've been doing it since the first Trump administration. And so necessity is the mother of all invention. And if you starve people of access to chips, is it really that surprising that they'll get their technologists to start training their programs on much smaller amount of chips and try and figure out ways around that? Well, that's kind of what's happened. Now, could the Chinese state have backed this company secretly or something like that with much more money than is being said? Yeah, I mean, in theory. But, the reports all over the internet say that there was only 140 engineers working on this or something. I think OpenAI have 10 times that. So, sometimes people just hit on a really good idea, and especially if they're being put under restrictions, they often do that. And then the one other thing that I'd highlight is that, look, if it's correct that the whole AI thing has been somewhat of a bubble, that does not mean AI is fake. It does not mean that, but it may mean that it was a little bit overhyped and it attracted too much money. What happens when a sector attracts too much money is you get sort of poor capital allocation. The very old people here will remember pets.com in the dot-com bubble, which ceased to exist shortly after the dot-com bubble. When you attract that much capital, you can kind of gunge up the system, make people a little flabby, make people a little lazy. When there's a lot of money sloshing around, it's a lot easier to justify hiring 1,400 people to work on your AI model. Whereas when you're not really exposed to that bubble environment and you have these technological pressures on you, as the Chinese currently do, I could see a case that they achieved this on a slimmed down budget.
John, let me bring you in here because it seems like a good moment. You wrote a piece for us at UnHerd in the last few days, quite predictive of this moment, you might say, in that you were observing more broadly, not just in the tech sector, not just in chips and AI, but more broadly, that stocks seem quite expensive, and you thought you smell a bit of a boom that might be about to bust. Tell us what the bigger picture looks like.
So if you sort of say that, when did the AI bubble begin? It begins with the release of ChatGPT. And that really just injects a whole new euphoria, this idea that we're into a new dawn, a new era. And the bookend to that might end up being DeepSeek. It's very early yet. It only just emerged last week. We're only a few days into this. I think we'll get a better idea in the course of the week. Whether it turns into an outright crash, whether it sort of is a slow burn, I think there's a very good chance we're going to enter a bear market. Because as Philip points out, this whole market is premised really increasingly on a handful of companies with the promise of some revolutionary breakthrough. Namely that, and the analogy is often used, that if we think of this as a gold rush, AI, NVIDIA is the shovel maker, but we haven't yet actually found the gold. The idea was that they would need an awful lot of shovels, and then they were going to find this massive seam of gold. If, in fact, DeepSeek has figured out a way to find the gold at a fraction of the cost, you don't need all those shovels, which means the NVIDIA share of the market begins to go. But in addition to that, there was a tremendous amount of hype in the other tech stocks, this expectation that when they find the gold, they're going to capitalize on this. So their own valuations were extremely high. And that wasn't just dragging the American stock market along with it. It was dragging the whole global sort of capital ecosystem along with it. That the American stock market now accounts for over half of the total market capitalization of the developed world in almost the same sort of ratio of the world as a whole. Massive amount of capital that's been sucked into America over the last couple of years. If that goes to the exits, then the downside is potentially huge. I think the PR departments at the Mag 7 stocks are going to be working overtime to try and downplay the story, to try and find, as Philip was pointing out, what are these sort of the weak elements, the weak links in this chain of narrative that's emerging around DeepSeek. They're going to try and discredit it. They have to keep their investors on board. If they can't, I think then we really could be in for quite a dramatic period over the coming months.
The reason this is more than just an economic or financial story is that we are, I was going to say week one. Today is literally 7 days after the new president was inaugurated, talking about a new golden era. And we know that Donald Trump, we know from his previous presidency, really cares about the stock market. And he wants stocks to go up. He sees it as a sign of his success. He talks a lot about how successful he was using that measure. It would have a huge political cost, would it not, if 1 week into the presidency, we start seeing a serious downturn or crash? I mean, what would the political ramifications of this be?
They're really interesting to think through. I mean, there is a possibility you could pin it on Biden. It's only been 7 days. I think some people, most people would intuitively think, if the company is handed over to the new boss and it starts going really badly after 1 week, it may not be the new boss's fault, So I think there's there could be a credible defense. Now, on the other side of that, you could say, well, Donald Trump's so bad at being president that he spooked the stock market within 7 days. Of course, neither of those things is actually true. This has to do with the Chinese technological development and a bloated AI sector in the United States. I think the real threat of a stock market crash would be on the broader economy, actually, because the economy's been very fragile. The American economy has been very fragile for a long time. It's been one of the only really growing Western economies. Europe's completely stagnant. Britain's completely stagnant. America's been growing, although there's a huge dispersion between the GDP figures and what people poll on the economy. And so it doesn't seem to be growing in a very normal way. The issue could be that the stock market crash could bleed into other parts of the financial sector. And I just highlight that there's a lot of debates going on, and has been for the past 6 months, about the enormous deficit in the United States. It's running a record peacetime government deficit, outside of a recession, that is. And a recession would just pile on top of that deficit. We could see a government deficit of 12 or 13% if you saw a recession and tax receipts dried up. And at that point, you could be looking down some sort of a fiscal crisis. I think that would be the really negative scenario for a Trump administration.
Right, so there's underlying vulnerabilities there. But I just want to push back on this idea that he could just say, that was all Biden, because to my mind, the incoming administration is tied up in some of these dreams to an unusual degree. Donald Trump has hugged Elon Musk very, very close. He was the first person he mentioned when in his victory speech. He talked about the beautiful sight of the space rocket being embraced by those two arms. He talks about crypto a lot. As we've seen, he's launched there's a Trump coin, there's a Melania coin. He's seen as very kind of involved philosophically in that movement. And were there to be a crash, the whole idea that it seems to be part of the Trump golden age, that really by just believing it, you can make it true, might start falling apart. John, am I being too negative, do you think? Or do you think this could be really bad for the new project?
Oh, absolutely. He's hugely vulnerable on this point, and you make a very good point. As Philip says, my own view is that there was always going to be a crash, regardless of who the president was, that this was a bubble. It was bound to burst at some point. In a sense, it doesn't matter politically, because whoever the incumbent president is gets the blame. You can say it's because of things beyond my control, but it doesn't matter. That's not the way the public vote. Trump's problem is that if you can picture him, it's as if he has gone in and mortgaged the entire estate and put it all into one big bet. And that's not just AI, but a particular model of AI. His assumption is that which has been promoted by the major companies in the United States in this sector. Twofold. One is it's going to be hugely expensive. It's going to be hugely energy demanding, and therefore his whole strategy of energy dominance is vital to this. That, cheap oil, cheap gas, this is what we need in abundance. And in the process, scrapping everything that was started in the way of industrial policy under the Biden administration, or at least saying he's going to scrap it, all the subsidies, the attempt to develop new manufacturing capacity in renewable energy. I don't see why he actually felt the need to pursue AI. He needed to actually do away with that, but he has. But that means everything depends on the success of this one venture. And there's a twofold problem here. First of all, if this can be done at a fraction of the energy cost that has been foreseen, that brings the whole energy dominance model. It just means it's blown out of the water. And the second thing is, if it can be done at a fraction of the cost, twofold. First of all, there's no justification for the kind of valuations we're seeing on these Mag 7 companies. But the second thing is, interestingly, it would seem to vindicate the Biden administration's antitrust campaign, the one particularly led by Lina Khan. Trump's argument, taking that, is taken on board the sort of the arguments of people like Elon Musk, is the scale needed. We have to have deregulation so that we can have capital concentration to raise the sums of capital needed to do this. But if small startups are going to be able to break through and create these technologies, that would suggest that is the right approach that the Biden administration was taking, was trying to keep them from getting so concentrated, to try and encourage a greater multiplicity of players. So in a sense, his entire strategy in the second week of office is now in question. If it fails, he doesn't have a backup plan.
Or you could say there are these two philosophical strains in the Trump project, aren't there, that have always been in tension. One is the more kind of MAGA populist strain, if you like, which might have been quite sympathetic to some of those antitrust Lina Khan initiatives, at least until very recently, and was much more about industry protectionism and kind of looking after those kind of workers. And the kind of Elon Musk strain, whether you call it techno-futurist or ultra-libertarian or optimist or whatever, it has become increasingly dominant. And I wonder, Phil, you've also tracked these kind of different strains in the populist project for the last few years. Could these kind of uncertainties readjust the balance inside Trump world? Do you think you could see a reassertion of a little bit more of the Trump 1.0, the original populist?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest critics in Trump world of the kind of libertarian Silicon Valley tendency that you're talking about is Steve Bannon. And if the stock market crashes out, I'm telling you, Steve Bannon is going to be everywhere. He used to work at Goldman, I think. I think he's an ex-finance guy. And he seems like kind of a perma-bear too. So I bet he's going to be out there if there's a stock market crash, kind of rubbing it in the face. But I think the techno-libertarian thing was kind of a bit weak anyway. I know that there was some controversy over H-1B visas a few weeks ago about letting a lot of mainly Indian immigrants in to do kind of white-collar jobs in tech, actually, in base-level programming, actually, coincidentally enough. And there was a huge pushback from that. I think that tendency to sort of push out the techno-futurism is kind of secular, as it were. But no doubt, if this all goes down, it'll empower the Bannons of the world, yeah.
Yeah, in which case, the figure of Elon Musk, who I would say has been more talked about than Donald Trump in the past few weeks. I mean, he is by far the most talked about person in the world, in part because he owns and dominates the leading free or leading speech platform. What happens to him in this? What if Tesla also really suffers a bit of a crash in the midst of this maelstrom? Suddenly, Elon Musk's power might seem a little bit diminished.
And his brand as well, because of course, to such a considerable degree, particularly in American politics, probably more than anywhere else, one's wealth is associated with one's intelligence and success. And Elon Musk has been given a fair bit of a pass simply because of the fact that he's the world's wealthiest man. But one can foresee a situation where there's an actual collapse in his own valuation and suddenly he'll find himself in the defensive. I think Philip's right. In a sense, you could say Bannon has been, I wouldn't say marginalized, but he's been given secondary status, and he's Trump's new sort of love interest, if you will, is Elon Musk. But you could see him falling out of love with Elon Musk if he's not supporting the brand. There's a real, I think part of the problem the Trump administration has, it's kind of muddled in its thinking. I mean, last administration, because he had on his trade team, they were controversial, but they had a coherent worldview back in 2017, which was using tariffs essentially as a tool of industrial policy. What we're seeing this time around, as we saw over the weekend with the tariffs imposed on Colombia, which make absolutely no sense from a trade point of view. All you're going to do is raise the price of imported Colombian goods because you don't have a domestic coffee industry. And the gas and fuel imports they'd be blocking with tariffs from Colombia, they can't replace domestically. So this
But John, it worked. I've got to interrupt here because, I mean, the Colombia example let's not.
No, it worked as a negotiating strategy, but not as a
Right.
trade strategy. And you
Right,
see,
but maybe that's all it ever was, right? Let's just state this for our audience so that it doesn't feel like we're skipping over the good news that Trump can celebrate today, because that seemed like a real foreign policy win for him. Like, he threatened these huge tariffs on Colombia. They backed down, and they're now going to accept, or they say they're going to accept, any number of Colombian illegal residents in the US if they get shipped back to Colombia. That's a success story for Trump. So if he's going to use tariffs just as a negotiating tactic, week one, it feels like that's working.
Well, yeah, let us take at face value the claim, because we're going to the White House claim. If you read the Colombian statement, they have an entirely different take on it. Whether or not it's a victory, though, I think what the point I'm trying to make is that is very much, if you will, using tariffs to support a MAGA policy, which is the deportation. There's no economic reasoning in the use of the tariff policy. It would actually be counterproductive to American economic interests. And people like Bannon have been saying essentially that if we abandon that use of tariffs in a systematic way, which I think Elon Musk was probably in part behind the thinking that was pushing the administration away from this sort of systematic imposition of tariffs on China on the grounds that they wanted to maintain market access because they would actually stand to make more money again off AI innovations in China than they would get from trying to revive domestic manufacturing with tariffs. So I think there's a fight that's going to break out now. I mean, the Trump administration is always going to be beset with fights. There's so many internal contradictions. There's so many tensions in different alliances. But I think we've, to be in the second week, and we can probably anticipate there's going to be quite some fallout, unless, as I say, which is still possible, the DeepSeek story turns out to be a bit of a damp squib. That further investigation reveals actually it has been exaggerated. It's not as good. But or it's simply a one-off that long-term, the American industry is going to emerge and dominate this. But it's a very fragile narrative.
Phil, what is your take on Elon Musk? Because he's an unbelievably complicated figure to sort of draw together. If we think business-wise and geopolitically, he is more exposed to China than perhaps any other businessman. And yet he's sort of allied himself with this national populist. His business interests are completely wrapped up now with the federal government. I mean, SpaceX is basically a government agency. It is pretty much the Space Department. Tesla was enormously benefiting from government handouts and so on. How do we unravel it? And what do you think we should think of Elon in that context?
Having watched Elon Musk over the past 2 years, I can't come to any other conclusion, but he treats his businesses as a secondary concern. I think when he comes out and says, I don't really care about making money that much, I care about like big global human visions, I think he means it. Because what you've just said, right? He has all these business interests in China, and he's allied himself with an administration that's putting tariffs on EVs coming from China. That's not good for Tesla. Now, I think Elon's a smart guy. I think he'll figure out little loopholes around that and so on. For example, when they did the EV tariffs in Europe, they gave Tesla a loophole out of it. So they had a lesser tariff than the Chinese EVs. I'm sure Elon's looking for all those little parts to play while he's working in government. But I really do think he's primarily motivated by what he says he's motivated by. I think he's motivated by space exploration on the one hand. I think he's highly motivated by free speech. I don't think he likes the woke stuff for personal reasons. And I think he feels like he's part of a big political movement. And I think you especially saw that when as I said, the H-1B dust-up occurred over the visas. And he just got in line like within a couple of days. I think he's kind of willing to toe the MAGA line. So I'm actually not as convinced as John that there'll be an internal civil war in the Trump administration. I think that the momentum or the energy is actually quite intense, and it draws people along. The real question is, will the economy get very bad and the price of eggs go up? Those are the real questions for Trump, I think.
Last week, Davos took place, the gathering of the World Economic Forum, which is the kind of locus of so many conspiracies, but it's also genuinely the kind of center of the global elite. They gather there in this ski resort every year and talk about how they're going to make each other richer. And even in the Financial Times, which is kind of the house paper for that class of people, the write-ups of Davos were just tragic. you could feel tears pouring onto the page because they were saying everyone was unhappy. Everyone is so negative about Europe. They knew that the action was taking place over in Mar-a-Lago and in America, that this was no longer the place to be. You had all these sort of masters of the universe saying, we're just putting all of our money in America. That's where it's at. Europe is over. Is there any chance that the kind of herd is stampeding too far in the pro-American direction? It feels almost like the opposite of the last time Trump won, when everyone was so negative about him and there was this universal sense that he was going to be dangerous and reckless. And then he turned out to be much more moderate and responsible in terms of the effects of his presidency. Has the herd run too far in the other direction? Is everyone now bigging up the US economy, the future of the Trump golden era? And what we might see in contrast is quite a big disaster.
I do think there's a real risk of it. I find it interesting. You mentioned the Financial Times, and its headline about Davos was that Europe reaches peak pessimism amid this euphoria about America. I think that, if anything, is a signal of a bubble at a top. Once you say there's just no hope for Europe and all the future is in America, you could sort of say, well, this is exactly the time to get back out of America. And so much money, so much capital has flowed from East Asia and Europe into the US, and then in the last couple of months from emerging markets as well, that for a small amount of that to go into reverse, as it will, capital is footloose and people aren't investing in America they're not leaving Germany to invest in America necessarily because they believe the long term is guaranteed to be in America. They're riding that wave. And if the wave does go into reverse, I think Philip touches upon this and he's made that point, and I think he's right. The possibility of a fall in the market, that would be so serious that it would begin to create a liquidity crisis and a reverse wealth effect, which would lead to a recession, I think is very high, because he's absolutely right. The American economy is actually far more fragile than it appears. It hasn't been growing that much, and it's entirely fed by debt. In fact, for every $2 of federal debt taken on, they're only getting $1 of added growth. So they're not even running to stand still at this stage. They're basically sticking fingers in the dike. And once they can no longer keep doing that, once that credit isn't available, then I think there's a real chance of a recession. And whether or not we could say it's Trump's fault, the fact is, the way the American voters judge their incumbents is what happens when they're in office. He would get the blame.
Phil, I'm going to give the last word to you here. Are we now victim of kind of over-enthusiasm for a temporary news story here? Like, basically, correct us. Are we being suddenly too negative, too bearish? We have one bad news story, a little bit of a mini run on some stocks, and suddenly we're saying it's the end of the boom and the Trump era has failed. Put us back into the world of reality.
I think behind the scenes, the Trump people are actually aware of the economic problems. They're not going to highlight them too much. But just to give an example, it was widely thought that Trump was going to pick a kind of true believer in tariffs for Treasury Secretary, and he went out and extended an arm to Wall Street. A bunch of Wall Street guys are running the Treasury right now under Scott Bessent. Now, they're heterodox Wall Street guys, no doubt about it, but they're still Wall Street guys. They're a faction that are really being overlooked, with the Bannons on the one hand and the techno-futurists on the other hand. But if there's any economic problems or trouble, I guarantee you that it'll be the kind of Wall Street adults in the room who get the upper hand. I think they're really the ones to watch. And they are very, very aware of what John's talking about, with the overextension of debt, with the illiquidity in foreign bond markets, which people don't talk about that much. And they're looking at things like in Britain last week, we had a real shakedown of the sterling bond market, everything. So I think there are kind of adults in the room in the Trump orbit occupying the correct positions of power, who I think you'll see enormously empowered as a faction if any of these negative things come to pass. And I think they are kind of expecting that it might happen.
And their effect will be cautionary then. They will pull back some of the more radical ideas and push the Trump project back to a more orthodox approach?
It's a possibility. The other possibility is that Scott Bessent himself has mentioned that there might try to be some sort of a new global monetary arrangement. That's a whole other podcast, but they might think of a new Bretton Woods system. They might think of some sort of deal with the Chinese like the Plaza Accords in the 1980s with the Japanese, to try and bring the dollar down. These are very interesting proposals that, in my opinion, are actually very good. They could be very radical, but at the same time, they kind of fit with within mainstream economic sense, as opposed to the tariffs, which I think John is right. Most of the tariff policies are just going to cause inflation.
Phil Pilkington, John Rapley, thank you so much.
Been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Well, there you have it. We are only a few hours into the second week of the Trump administration, and already there are market jitters. We had some really interesting and somewhat concerning ideas there from both John Rapley and Phil Pilkington. Let us know in the comments what you think. This was UnHerd.